Good morning, everyone. This is Craig Spiesel from the Online Trust Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you everyone today here to the webinar. Joining me today is Jeff Wilbur, Vice President of Marketing from Iconics and Vice President of Research for the Online Trust Alliance. I do want to remind everyone we will be taking questions, and I do encourage you to open up the resource guide that we had provided a link to earlier so you may follow along with us. We will be recording this webinar today and posting the slides and materials shortly thereafter. So for those of you who are new to OTA, I'd like to kind of share who we are and a little bit about how we got here. We are a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to promote and enhance online trust and promote innovation and the vitality of online services. And how we do that is through many efforts such as this, publishing documents to advance best practices. We do a lot of work at convening public partnerships and also educating businesses and policymakers regarding our efforts. And for example, last week we had a very large congressional staff briefing to walk through this program and our research. And again, ultimately, we want to do benchmark reporting and provide positive affirmation to those organizations that walk the talk. So some of our key initiatives that you may be aware of, one of them is the IoT Trust Framework. The framework is a very broad set of core strategic principles that have been embraced by a broad coalition of international organizations to really set a benchmark for security, privacy, and long-term support of IoT devices. So I encourage you to check that material out. One of the other areas that we do a tremendous amount is our, our annual online trust audit. This year, our audit, we'll be reviewing close to 1,000 websites for best practices in security, privacy, and consumer protection. The methodology of this was released last week, and following RSA, we'll also be doing a follow-up webinar on that. And we also have a series of white papers really about our vision of trust. We have one that we're releasing tomorrow on email, trustworthy email. We have one on advertising and also IoT. So these are just some of the key initiatives that we've been working on as an organization, supported by a very broad group of coalition members, organizations, and stakeholders. So I mentioned IoT is a real important thing for us. It's really an important effort for all organizations today. And as we see this connected world in our homes, our office, critical controls, industrial controls, the smart grid and such, it's really important that we look at all the vulnerabilities and such coming forward. And as we've witnessed, IoT devices are becoming a proxy for harm in the online world as well as the offline world. So I encourage you, if you haven't looked at it, review our materials on there. We encourage you to look at them. And we're moving forward in this area. We're working with some third parties to help develop some certification programs to have baseline security and privacy standards for these devices. So Jeff, we're going to transfer the call to you here, and kind of you can share a little bit.
Sure. So we extended our definition of cyber incidents this year. As we looked at we've been doing this breach guide now for several years, and we expanded the title to Cyber Incident and Breach Readiness Guide because we saw that there were a lot of incidents that weren't really covered under a traditional breach. So we looked at really where do infected machines happen, or attacks like denial of service attacks on a business that materially affected them, or these business email compromise attacks where even though your machine isn't compromised through social engineering, someone is deceived to send money to a bad guy who sent them an email. So we really wanted to look at the broad definition of an incident. And this really isn't trying to be a legal definition, but essentially it's unauthorized access or extraction of data, disruption of availability, as you see, or something that caused financial or reputational harm. So we took a very broad look at it, and we'll show you the numbers here shortly. It's not hard to find examples. On almost any given day or certainly any given week, you can find examples of this. And we've got a couple here that happened in the last week or two that demonstrate that the incidents go beyond traditional breaches. So a couple of weeks ago, the Sundance Film Festival was hacked essentially with a cyber attack. It disabled the box office, kind of brought it down. People had to go to cash instead of doing online payments, and it was highly disruptive. You know, exactly why anyone did it, we don't know, but it certainly was disruptive. And this next example is one of ransomware, which is again another one. Now that is an infection of a machine and locks it out, but in this case it went beyond the we've got your data, give us money to get it back. This was a very high-end hotel and in Austria, and in this case they actually took over control of some of the systems in the hotel and locked all the guests out of their rooms and essentially shut down the operations of the hotel until a ransom was paid, which according to this article it was. So these just show, so this one went beyond kind of the traditional cyber element that you think of infecting a machine or grabbing some data, and it went to actually impacting the physical access into things. So you can imagine that that could go even further into physical harm if someone got a hold of a system like that. So these are just examples of incidents that go well beyond the traditional breach that we tend to think about. So this year, in addition to some of the breach sources that we've used in the past, we reached out to a variety of organizations. So the first bullet there is where we get a lot of our breach information, risk-based security and the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse and such. We also got input from many of the government agencies, some of the information sharing centers, and of course industry who keep their track of their own different metrics. So we compiled all these and analyzed them to kind of come up with an extended set of metrics for this year. So this is kind of the key metrics that we came up with. So historically, we really only in this annual report talked about the number of breaches, and so that has run in the 3,000 range, 2 to 3 to just under 4,000. This year, we're saying that there were 82,000 incidents. So that's about 20 times the historical number that we've reported because we extended the definition. Looking inside that, you can see a number of specific metrics there. We've assessed that over 90% of them were preventable. We'll talk about that in a second. There were over 4,000 breaches confirmed worldwide through those variety of sources. A record number, 4.2 billion records were disclosed in those breaches, and then large increases in a number of different areas. In DDoS attacks, the BEC is the business email compromise. Those are the fake emails that cause you to send money somewhere. So a 12x increase in losses for BEC just over the last year. Rise in ransomware, a very high cost of ransomware when you include the downtime and the ransom paid and everything else, and then a huge increase in phishing sites. And there was no sector that was not touched in this area. It really spanned the whole range from businesses to government to financials and healthcare and medical. So no one was immune from these attacks.
Yeah, Jeff, one point that I think was interesting, our 82,000 may be a low number. If we took an aggressive view, the number of incidents that we believe cause material harm, financial harm or reputational harm, could have exceeded 200,000, but we are being somewhat conservative in this number. So again, if you look at the definitions that Jeff shared, is what type of cyber incidents are causing harm to businesses. And the old model of focusing on breaches, which what's reported is consumer data breaches, is very limited. And I think the other element is that one of the challenges of looking at state data breaches is there's no federal definition, and that's been one of the challenges as we've looked across the landscape of trying to pull this data together.
Yeah, I'll just tack onto that a little bit. It's very hard to come to the true number because for a variety of reasons. Craig just mentioned some. One is that the rule of what's required to be reported in any of these areas varies, and many of them are therefore unreported. And so, ransomware attacks, even business email compromise, depending on whether they get reported to law enforcement or not, many don't. So a lot of them are just kept internally to kind of reduce, as Craig said, the reputational harm of just the embarrassment of knowing that something happened. So the real number is likely much, much higher than this, and because there are attacks happening all the time in the background. And so, but the point we wanted to make this year is that it's much, much broader than the traditional thinking about just publicly reported breaches. So I mentioned on the previous slide that over 90% are preventable of these incidents. And so if you kind of dig into how did those happen, how did those incidents occur, there are a number of buckets you can put that into, and some of the data that we analyzed looked at these different reasons. And most of them are pretty obvious if you have good cybersecurity and hygiene. But just walk through a couple of these just to make the point of what we called preventable. If you weren't patching known vulnerabilities, so there's a cadence and a discipline here to keep up with it. Misconfiguration, again, that's another discipline thing. One of the big ones in the breach area is unencrypted data. If you encrypt your data, even if they get lost or if data is taken, it can't be used. And so encrypting your data is one of the points we make in our security considerations that we'll talk about. Using applications or devices that have passed their end of life, they become vulnerable and there aren't patches available. That's a big one. And then, of course, employees make mistakes, and there's a number of points there about the types of mistakes they can make. And then the last one there is the one I've already mentioned, business email compromise, more of a social exploit where, again, the systems are not compromised, but someone is deceived into using their authority to do something that then harms the company, like send money to a foreign account.
Yeah, great. One point on there that the middle one, end-of-life devices, this is an area that we expect we're going to see more and more, especially as a result of IoT devices being brought into the workplace. Non-critical controls, but everything from the connected coffee maker to the corporate boardroom that has a smart TV, as these devices become connected to the network, and over their life, are they updated and patched appropriately? We're very concerned that becomes a big vector that we're going to see more and more of.
Yeah, so the bottom line point on that one was that if with good discipline and controls, that entire bullet list there would be could be prevented in terms of causing disruption or loss of data.
Excuse me. Well, great, Jeff. I appreciate you walking through those here, and I apologize for my cough here today. What we want to do now is kind of walk through the guide itself. Kind of Jeff shared with you the baseline of where we are, the threat vectors, the trends where we're having it, and some of the key things you can do. And so we're going to walk through the guide, some of the key points. It's about a 55-page document with several worksheets and such. It's really as a resource for companies to better assess their risks, adapt best practices, and then also look at some other aspects in here. So we'll try to touch on these. Clearly, also, I see a few questions coming up. Feel free to put some questions, and we'll try to take them as we're speaking or at the end of the call here. So this is the 8th or 9th year that OTA has developed this guide, and the reason is we've come across more and more companies, members, and third parties that have an incident, and at the end of the day, being the impact is significant. And it's not just the financial one that Jeff mentioned, but the chaos that entails. It's also the reputational harm the company needs to deal with. And that's everything from internal confusion with employees to business partners. So that's the reality. And the point is, by not having a plan, this is what will happen to you. And so our whole goal is to be prepared for the likelihood you will have one. But one of the things that we're very clear about in our discussions, discussions with lawmakers and regulators, is there's no perfect security. So we don't want to victimize the victim, so to speak. But at the same time, there's no excuse for not having a plan together. And so one of the things that we believe as you're developing a plan, this is not a one-time plan. This is something that organizations should update and review quarterly. And also recognize that you have some form of sensitive information that's of interest to someone, whether that's employee data and the payroll data for identity theft for them, whether it's your corporate data and business plans that can be used for stock manipulation, or customer data. So again, we think it's really important. One of the frustrations I have is someone says, well, we don't need to worry because we're not collecting consumer data. And as Jeff mentioned, those those recent incidents of ransomware and such, that affects everything. So again, you need to have a plan. And one of the things that we'll talk about is the importance of employee training and awareness as you go through here. So obviously we all make mistakes, and one of the things that we try to look at is when we've developed some of these best practices is what have we learned? And so we're going to go through some of these things here. We also, you'll see in the guide, we have a checklist. And these are many things that we encourage companies to go through. And you may end up adding more to this, but again, things all the way through. The fourth one down, audit of insurance. It's incredible what we've learned in this state of cyber insurance, as it's somewhat in a very immature industry right now, of the gaps that organizations have not recognizing what they consider an incident is covered by their insurance policy. For example, some of the business email compromises that Jeff identified, in some cases policies don't cover those because that's considered willful negligence. The employee provide the credentials or made the transfer. It wasn't an actual breach. Now you could debate that from a legal perspective, from an expectation, but that's a reality. So you need to understand these things. So we'll go through all these areas, but this is a very important section of the guide to help you do this assessment here. So as part of that assessment, it's really important that boards and executive teams continually review this. But two things that we think even more important is do this assessment throughout your organization. And it's not an IT issue. And that's one of the challenges. As one of the earlier slides I pointed out, everyone in an organization needs to be involved. If you're outsourcing or you're managing, collecting data in different parts of your business, that's really important. So marketing needs to be involved, operations, sales, perhaps investor relations. But also, as we've moved to more cloud services, we need to understand the assessment of all of our vendors and cloud providers. What security standards? And if I were to say one major area here that comes up over and over is what designates an incident for your vendors to report to you. And so that's an area that you need to negotiate and understand up front, and at the very least understand what it does or doesn't mean. You may not be able to influence Amazon to change when they notify you, but you need to know that because ultimately it's your data and you're accountable. And so as we look to all the virtues of cloud services, we also need to recognize that our security or our risk assessment needs to include those as well. So what we're going to do through here is through our lessons learned, we've actually pulled together our top 20 list of security best practices. And they're not necessarily in any specific order of priority, but Jeff, I'm kind of these here, we're going to go through, pick one or two on each one and kind of maybe from your learnings, what do you think is on this slide here, would you encourage people to focus on?
Sure, and I'll just make the point that Craig opened up talking about our other initiatives in OTA, and they're really all built on the same foundation, which is establishing and following best practices for security and consumer protection and privacy. And so these security principles really we use not only in the incident guide, which has some specific ones apply to it, but also in our annual audit and in the IoT framework that we have. So you'll see these things come up in multiple places because they're all built on the same foundation. So on this first 5, I guess I would pick multi-factor authentication as something that is very important and can help prevent a lot of this nastiness that can happen. And the reason is most attacks these days happen through a fake email is generally the starting point. Over 90% of incidents kind of start there, and often the purpose is to steal credentials and then go use them somewhere else. And so if you implement multi-factor authentication, it adds that extra layer of protection and kind of ring of protection that, in some cases it can still be broken, but it raises the bar very high for the bad guy to go then deal with multi-factor instead of just a simple username password type attack.
Yeah, great, Jeff. And actually, a key point is Jeff mentioned how these tie to other best practices. Multi-factor authentication is a new criteria that we're adding to the 2017 audit. So we'll be companies and organizations that have implemented multi-factor authentication will get bonus points on that. I guess, I would actually, Jeff, on this list, I would combine 3 and 4. And, the whole concept of least privileged user access is really this concept of, if my password gets compromised, my credentials, what's limit the threat and the impact of that. And so all too often what we find is organizations don't have a really effective password management program and policy. Employees move from one group to another. So maybe I was working for the legal group in one area, and now I've moved to sales, so I don't need access to those servers and to revoke policies. Same thing on that aspect of external vendors, and that's the one that we find quite often. People change jobs and they no longer have any business reason to have access to Salesforce or something of that nature, so you should make sure that you revoke in those privileges in those areas. Let's go to the next slide of some of the others, Jeff, and kind of look. Whoops, went the wrong way, it looks like. There we go.
Yeah, so on this one, I guess I would pick number 7. I already mentioned it, that email is the primary initial attack vector in most cases, and so email authentication, both inbound and outbound. So to protect your own company, we're primarily talking about inbound checking of email, so to make sure that messages are really from who they say they are, and then you can block or quarantine messages that may not be, and then to protect your company and misuse of your own email, you want to authenticate your outbound emails so that any of your customers can also be protected as well, and so you're protecting your brand and your domain as you do that, and that can go a long way toward limiting the types of attacks that can get into your organization.
Well, Jeff, I'm going to go with you and actually build upon what you just said there on email authentication. As many of you know, that's been the foundation of a lot of what OTA started with, and it's continues to be a really key issue. The white paper we're releasing tomorrow talks about that, but the area that I'd expand upon that is your vendors. And the reason is comes to back to the phishing and the business email compromise, which all too often companies, criminals know who your vendors are, and they try to then masquerade in them. And so one of the things that I'd go a step further is require your vendors to be authenticating mail to you, so you're able to reject and identify ones that are phishing or spoofed mail. So again, key issues, and again, we have that in the plan and talking about that as a contractual requirement for your vendors. I'll go on this one here, and then Jeff, you can follow up on me here. Is again the updates and the patches. We see this over and over. Again, servers are not being patched, updated, and it's a complex area, but there's very simple tools that can identify any server, and by probing, and then obviously you can then execute an attack against a server. So that sounds pretty much basic security 101, but all too often we find that's not being done. And that's, one of the areas that ransomware and malware's been successful. So, encourage you to think about multi-level defenses in that area to also protect you on there. But again, the first defense is patch as much as possible, and then obviously build in multi-layer security to detect that malware on your devices.
I guess to just build on what you said about ransomware, it is one of the highest growth attack areas we've seen in the last year. And if you look at some reports, there are 30, 40,000 devices per month that get compromised. That's just a huge number. Now they may, multiple of them may be in the same organization, but that's such a huge number, and the idea of kind of capturing and holding your data ransom, especially in a hospital environment or somewhere where access to data is critical and maybe even life-altering, is critical. So I would say number 15, backing up your key data to offline storage. Being more disciplined and more proactive about that, so that if ransomware were to hit your system, you aren't caught short and at risk for all your data being stolen or wiped out. I think that's a huge one because of the rise in that area of attack.
Great. Well, I guess wrapping up the top 20, I'm going to go with number 17, and partially because that's somewhat a new one, a vulnerability reporting program. I'll explain what that is in a second. But the whole idea is, as companies, people find vulnerabilities in your site. Some of them are researchers, some of them are just users, and some of them are people that are hackers. But the whole point is you want to extend the welcome mat, so to speak. You want to get that data because they can be that early warning for you and provide you that ability to make those updates. Unfortunately, the vast majority of companies do not have a program like this. Yes, some of the software companies themselves, but I can't, it's very rare that you find a site that has this. And so it's now becoming an area of concern of neglect or negligence, excuse me, when you don't have the ability to accept and review a report, and people have been trying to report to you. So one of the things is we were in our honor roll, that's our audit that's coming out, we'll be looking for this as a bonus point, and basically looking at this, is there a way to find this on the home page of the site? So you could have next to your privacy policy in terms of use, report a bug or report a problem, a link. It could go to an email, it could go to a page. We're indifferent, but we think it's very important you have that. The challenge is sometimes these are embedded someplace on a site, but they're not discoverable for the home page. So again, it's something that we think is very important, and from our discussions with both the FTC and class action attorneys, you don't want to be in a situation where someone has tried to report a vulnerability and you either ignored it or it went to junk, because again, that shifts the discussion from a vulnerability to one of a liability and negligence. Jeff, on your end?
Yeah, I'll just add to that a little bit and then pick one of my own. But I'm glad we're doing that this year, that we're looking for who is doing vulnerability reporting that's easily discoverable. I think my gut feel is we're going to find that adoption is very low, but it needs to be higher so we can shine some light on that area. I guess on this one I would pick number 19, third-party assessments. There are a lot of tools out there, many of them free, that can assess various aspects of your site configuration. We talked about the fact that many of the preventable incidents that happened were, and Craig talked about earlier, staying on top of patching and such. And in looking at that, there are tools out there that you can run regularly on a daily basis, weekly basis, that you can look at your configurations and how they map to the latest vulnerabilities and see whether you're at risk, and very quickly and easily get indications on whether you should take action in those areas. So I think that's a very important one.
Great. And just as a follow-up, 2 points here. If you're one of the attendees in the webinar and you've got a great vulnerability reported program, let us know. We want to shine at the highlights of that. And it's a whole range of things that we've seen out there. And we want to, again, getting back to our mission, our goal is to promote best practices and recognize companies that are doing that. So we're trying to get beyond the choir, especially for any consumer-facing site. We really encourage that. I'll go a step further here on this slide here is, I'll add a third one here, is DDoS protection. And get back to, Jeff, the example you showed from Sundance. Many of these DDoS ones are being done for either reputation or financial harm, or some of them are also for ransom. In other words, they're going to continue to do your DDoS attack on your site until you do your Bitcoin transfer. And so be thinking about this. Are you prepared? Because this is becoming an area, and what they'll do, it's not just your site's taken down for a day or 2 days. They'll take it down for a few hours, and they'll let it go back up, and they'll take it back down. So that creates even more chaos for you. You don't know when your site's going to be available. If you're an e-commerce site, you can't afford that. So again, think about, what are you doing? What do you have in place for when that happens? So, providing my cough doesn't wear me out here, we're going to try to walk through a few of the other things here. We've talked about the problem threats. We've talked about what you can do. But one of the other areas is really thinking about the data you have in the first place. The whole adage is if you don't have the data, you can't lose it. And that's really important. And so one of the things that OTA talks about is this concept of data stewardship. And what we encourage companies to be thinking about all the data you have and thinking about all the areas that fall into play. And if you were to go around here, is what are the regulatory environment that you live in? Not live in physically, but your organization. And that could be the US, it could be the EU. And be thinking about all the issues here. How do you acquire the data? Do consumers have a choice to opt in, or how can they opt out? Thinking about your usage of the data, storage, all the way through, and then revalidating the business purpose. It is incredible when some of the breaches that I've come across, that data that's gotten lost, that they really found they don't really have a business purpose for it anymore, but they still were collecting it. And then how do you dispose it or archive it? So that's the whole concept of data stewardship, to walk through the whole process of your data. The other aspect is, once you have it, is thinking, how do you manage it? And again, this comes into a big area. And the big point in this one here is your training. Employee training is really critical of how to handle the data, how do you manage it and such, who do you share with, and then all the way through the process here. So this is a key element over on the whole guide. I mentioned we have about 4 pages on the guide that talks about this, and encourage you to really go through this and get an assessment. And again, think about data minimization. Yeah, again, collect the least amount as you need, keep it as short as possible, and get rid of it as quick as possible. Doing that, you're going to minimize the threat landscape significantly. I'm going to jump to cyber insurance. Again, I want to thank, we have several insurance companies that have joined OTA and provided a lot of input here. It is a challenge. It is harder and harder to underwrite an organization's security risk. And so cyber insurance is rapidly evolving. Key areas to think about, we've outlined quite a bit on the paper. One thing that has come up, I say 2 things. One is, what's willful negligence, as I mentioned earlier. the employee that gets an email that tells the subordinate to do an electronic funds transfer. And we've seen cases where they're collecting and mining data from social platforms to be able to send that very precise, very crafted, very personal email to an organization. And again, being that it doesn't take that much skill to find out who an executive is and who their administrative assistant. And when that executive is overseas, they send that mail saying, I need this transfer, or I forgot my password. So that's one area, where's that area in the social engineering aspect? It is an area for training, but are you covered? The other area is what is actually covered and what's reasonable costs. And one of the areas is excuse me, is who is approved attorneys. And for that, a lot of the policies say, well, we will pay reasonable legal costs. We've seen an incident recently where a firm needed specialized law firm in security and privacy. What the insurance company deemed as reasonable was a set or a panel of law firms, and ironically, not a single one of those had that type of experience. And the difference of the rates was $200 for this panel or $800 for the law firm that had the expertise. So again, what they determined as reasonable was not necessarily reasonable for this company that had to deal with this issue. So lesson is find out who those are, find out who those companies are, negotiate that up front. Same exact thing with the forensic side. They'll say the similar thing is we'll cover normal reasonable costs for forensics. It will be based on their vendors that they've retained. Know who those are, and again, develop relationships with them in advance is really important. And again, I'm sharing these examples not to belittle the insurance company, but it's one of the challenges that we have in many areas. And again, getting that firm involved is really critical here. Anything you add on that, Jeff? Whoops.
No, I think you covered that.
Great. So we kind of talk about that. And by the way, one other thing to think about, I mentioned forensics here, is in the midst of an incident, you may want to consider retaining your forensics firm through your law firm. And that will provide some protection certainly if there's an issue of discovery of that data. So be thinking about that. But again, it underscores the importance of doing all this in advance. Review your insurance coverage, create plans in place, connect with your legal counsel, all in advance. Because again, the time to do this is not in the middle of putting out the fire. So the guide which we walk through is really trying to provide a cookbook, so to speak, of developing a plan. And again, it's creating and empowering a team of first responders. Again, the challenge is, do these first responders have authority? Are they available on the weekends, holiday weekends? How do you handle that? Who do they reach out to? The other element is another area of a big complaint that I have is every year we tell people to develop relationships with law enforcement in advance. Call the FBI and find out who your designated contact would be, possibly contact the Secret Service, but find out who those contacts are in advance. What we find is there is some variations throughout the country of what the Bureau and the Service looks for and in an incident. And so sometimes they have a unique form that they may want to have. And the whole point is developing that relationship in advance, understand what they need is going to really expedite in the chaos of an event. Especially when they may be asking for some data you don't normally retain. That can help a great aspect there. Communication concepts or templates is really important. We'll talk about those in a few minutes, but be prepared. You don't want to be drafting everything from scratch in the middle of the storm. So we've seen some great examples where companies have web pages set up, email communications and various based on ordinances. Again, have it all in advance. Training we talked about, Regulatory and legal review, which we'll touch on in a few seconds. Cyber insurance, obviously, is really important. And continually testing. And these are the basics. These are the ABCs, so to speak, of a good plan. And we have quite a bit of information here. There's a lot of other organizations that have resources. Your own law firm might, and actually your insurance company may also work with you to also review your plan. And so, they don't want to have a loss, and they also want to minimize that. And so they can be a partner in these areas as well. So I encourage you to look at all those resources to optimize. And again, doing tabletop exercises, continually critiquing and refining is really, really important. So one of the challenges we've all been faced with is this wide array of notifications we get. We touch on that in the guide. Unfortunately, whether we like it or not, is in the US, we have a patchwork of laws. So for example, effective January 1 of this year, these are changes that occurred. So just what is personal information? For example, logon credentials, biometrics, license plate data, those are all now considered personal information. Encryption requirements have changed as well. So all of these areas, and I'm sure we've missed some, but the whole point, this is really a big challenge. I personally believe, and I should say OTA believes, that this is a huge burden on companies that makes it very hard. So right now, what it really means, you need to make your notification plans to get the highest bar possible in this area here, and be prepared for this. And there are law firms, and again, the challenge is the expense to navigate. And the point also is, understand is this is not where you have a nexus, it's where you have a customer or a user. And a single user triggers that notification in that state. And if you don't know where they physically reside at this time of the year, then you really have a bigger challenge. And again, underscores some of the complexities of this whole area. So understand, whoops, would be good if I know the arrow. Here we go here. So understand you have to do the different types of notifications. Depending upon where you are, there's notifications obviously to different audiences. And how you do that, the tone and such is very different. Obviously, internal teams, they start getting phone calls. Your key partners and customers, that may be a letter, but it also may be a phone call from an executive. Regulators, the FTC and the State Department of Justice, they have different requirements to them. Obviously, law enforcement, we encourage that. And again, law enforcement, one of the challenges, don't assume that law enforcement shares data with regulators. They don't. By default, they don't. So again, another challenge of this framework that we have in the US. And then impacted parties, and that's where the states all have their different definitions. And let's not forget the press and media. Be thinking about that. How do you craft that message? So again, the whole point is to think about this, and also to be thinking about the tactics, depend upon your audience, the tactics, the tone, the timing. And I have here the technology as the last one. Years ago, many of us recall the big Target breach, and Target recognized they need to send out millions of emails in a very short time frame. And they went to their email service provider, who needed that excess capacity, and they used an old server. And unfortunately, that server, the mail address that it came from, was target at, I believe, bfi01.com. And the end result was that email address created more anxiety, thinking that it was a phishing email. And we can joke about that, but again, it was an old server for an organization that actually is no longer around, the name, but they use that capacity to send it out. So technically it went out, but they didn't think about how that would be perceived. So again, be thinking about that. And again, if you have 1 million customer records, who has the capability to be able to push out those notices to you, and the technology? Be thinking about that, and really be careful about the from address. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, earlier, make sure that mail is fully authenticated as well, so consumers don't think it's a spoofed or forged email. So, huge challenge in the regulatory landscape, which I teed up a little bit before here. First of all, if you have a single customer in the EU, you need to be aware of the EU requirements. They're very specific on data breach. They're very specific on notification to your regulatory authority, and failure to do that could impose penalties of up to 4% of your annual turnover or your annual revenue. Big challenge. So just because you're in the US, I encourage you to be aware and read the information on what's called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Directive out there. Really important. I mentioned earlier the frustration that we have on the 46 different state laws. Last week we did kind of propose once again our framework for some model legislation. We really think that we need to move the bar up, and again, but the challenge is it won't be successful if it's done at the lowest level. And unfortunately, some of the trade organizations wanted to have the lowest level, which means that you're going to have some significant states are going to fight this. So again, should be the highest bar. We also believe that the state attorney general should have the right to enforce, not unlike canned spam. So again, you have federal legislation. It preempts all the state laws, but if the attorney general of a state feels that their constituents have been harmed, they should have the right to enforce. And the reason that creates a lot of concern, but we've had canned spam out there for almost 13, 14 years, and we've yet to see in a case where attorney general has abused that. The other challenges just are the way we have is rulemaking capability to keep it up and current. And we would think that legislation would provide the FTC to have that capability. They don't have it today. Other areas is minimal standards for credit monitoring, because what happens is state laws say you need to provide ID theft monitoring. It doesn't really define, is that 7/24? What are the hours? What are the services? So we do think there should be some specification there. We do believe there should be timing notification. To be notified 6 months later after the detection does little to protect you from ID theft. So there are other statutes out there now that are saying within 30 days. Some we've seen in other areas of 15 days. So we should be at minimum level. Hopefully companies can do better than that. And then also for SMBs and home-based businesses. And so one of the challenges there right now is the vast majority of state laws talk about only consumer accounts. And so if you have a small business account and it's compromised, you should also get the same protections afforded to others. So those are some of the foundations we have. There's other things, and happy to have follow-up discussions with anyone on the call on these here. So we've kind of very quickly gone through a tremendous amount of data, a tremendous amount of work and effort from many of our members. I want to thank all of them, and they're listed on the guide, as well as thank our sponsors here, and VeriSign and Symantec, LifeLock, and IdentityGuard. But what do you do from here? Obviously, we want to review the guide, but this is an outline. Again, in this next week, identifying your company, who are your external service providers, who should be your law enforcement contacts, your data owners, and walk through this in a 90-day plan and a 6-month plan. This doesn't happen overnight, but think about this, and depending upon your business, maybe what we have on this slide is achievable, maybe it isn't. But we encourage you highly to go through that. So again, all this material is up on our website right now. You'll see this. We will post this briefing today. There's actually our presentation from our congressional briefing last week, and we'll have more information up there. So we encourage that. And we also have additional resources here to go to. I mentioned all these resources. That's the URL, otaalliance.org/incident. Our vision papers up here, and that are sponsoring companies. So Jeff, we have a few minutes left, and I haven't lost my voice totally, and take some questions. But before we do that, do you have anything that you want to touch on yourself that we think we either missed on or we need further uh, clarification?
No, just a very high level comment, and it should go without saying, but to be proactive and intentional in all these areas is really the spirit with which this is done, of creating the plan ahead of time, thinking through all the issues so that, and you mentioned it several times along the way, that you don't get caught trying to deal with all this stuff in the midst of absolute chaos when you've had a breach or you're undergoing a ransomware attack or something else. And so I think that kind of attitude toward it is the most important element, because it can kind of roll down through all the specifics.
Great. Hey, Jeff, a question came in here about email authentication, and I'm going to let you take this one here. But so I understand there's 3 different authentication standards: SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Which one should I use and why?
Okay. Well, they all 3 do different things, and just to try to answer that very quickly, SPF and DKIM are used to allow a recipient of a message to verify that it came from the actual sender, and they kind of complement each other. They use different techniques to allow that verification. DMARC, actually, if you think of it as a layered thing, sits on top of those. So given that one or both of those are present, SPF or DKIM, DMARC lets you get reports back from the recipients or receivers of email on whether your authentication is passing or failing, and it also allows you to tell the recipients what to do with messages that fail authentication. So you can say, hey, all my emails authenticated properly, so if it doesn't pass, trash it, or put it in the junk folder. So they actually, Craig, I know you've recently been using the term email authentication cocktail. That's probably a pretty good description, because it really is the combination of those 3 together that gives you the best protection.
Great. And actually, we have, like I said, this paper we're releasing tomorrow. We have a lot of resources on that and to go there. But again, I think they're all there. A question I'm going to take is, you mentioned vulnerability reporting. Is an email address sufficient? So that's a hard question, but let me tell you, it is sufficient on, I guess you could say, providing a conduit. I think, though, you're going to set yourself up for failure by doing that, and some colleagues may disagree with that. The challenge is you have an email, so let's just say security@foo.com or abuse. You're going to get a lot of mail. You're going to get a lot of mail that you're going to have to then go through on there potentially. What we encourage is create a simple form to collect the data. And there's 2 reasons. It adds a little friction into that process, and obviously someone could bot the form. You put a CAPTCHA. But more importantly, it's if you collect the data, you have some drop downs. For example, if you have multiple products or companies or services, you have the drop down select, and the end result is then you get this information and you're able to parse it a lot quicker. So it benefits you as the company. The second benefit is, as the reporter, you're going to reduce the amount of frustration that can occur from someone saying, hey, I'm just trying to help you, and you keep on asking these rhetorical questions. It's like when you call up support sometime and they ask you, is your computer plugged in? It's like, you don't want to have that process. And the reason is sometimes those in academia can get very frustrated, and the last thing you want to do is have them go public. So again, I encourage at least a simple form process, have a CAPTCHA in there, and the other part is create a simple response, an auto response when it's submitted. Thank you for your submission, and set the expectation. One of our technicians will respond in 48 business hours or something of that nature. The other frustration we get is people submit it, and nothing happens. They don't get a thank you. They don't get a confirmation. And again, geez, they're not listening to me, so I'm going to go public. Another question came in is, what's the best place for current regulation as it affects American companies as far as GDPR? So the General Data Protection Directive, um, there's lots of places on that. You can query on that, but basically it's if you have a single customer in an EU country, you have to comply. If you have an incident, you are then held accountable. But it's very important to understand all those things. So I would just tell you to Google it. We do have some resources in our guide as well. That I encourage you to look through here. But again, it's understanding your elements there. And so one of the parts to help on here is we encourage you to reevaluate once a year where people reside in your and so your customers. So that can help you greatly in identifying what do you have to comply with. So if you go on, for example, page 38 of our guide, we have a fair amount of resources in that area there. So that's a great question here. I'm trying to look through some of the others here. You mentioned something about certificate types. Can you explain about that? So so there are multiple certificate types, and there's typically, for any site that has a log on, you need to have encrypted. I want to actually take a step back. We actually, as one of our best practices, encourage sites to have HTTPS everywhere or always on SSL. That's one of our core best practices. We've been advocating for several years. We have several white papers on it. And we also, it's a core part of our honor roll scoring. In order to do that encryption, you need to have a certificate. And there's three types. There's DV, domain validated, OV, organizational validated, or extended validated certificates. I'll also put a fourth one in there, is self-signing. We highly discourage, we discourage any self-signing. That may be fine for internal, but you'll get browser errors, and companies will be blocked. A DV cert is a very inexpensive certificate that you can get pretty much instantly that has a lot of high risk of it being forged and spoofed by other companies that want to spoof your brand. So we think a DV certificate is not a good practice. We actually give sites to get them, they have negative points in our assessment. So that really leaves OV, organization validate, that does have a validation process that helps to validate that the customer who's requesting a certificate is who they are. But the real one that we think is the best one is extended validation certificate that really provides a tremendous amount of validation of the company. You are who you are, you reside where you are, you're incorporated where you are. And also some of the browsers provide a trust indicator for such a certificate. So those would be the ones there. So we're unfortunately out of time right now. I do want to again thank everyone for their help today and their participation. All the materials are posted, and this presentation will be posted tonight as well. And if you have any follow-up questions, please email admin@otaalliance.org, and we'll be happy to try to help you. Thank you again, and have a great day.